Hello, everyone, and good evening. I'm Don Arleth, and you're watching World News Tonight, coming to you live from Warsaw on TVP World. 2025 is the year of Europe's strength. That's the joint declaration by the defense ministers of Poland, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Italy, who met today near Warsaw. We'll have more on that in just a bit, but first up, let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Donald Trump's inauguration is 1 week away, and the guest list is prompting speculation and controversy. Massive protests rock Bucharest over the canceled presidential elections amid allegations of Russian interference. And greenhouse gas emissions are falling in the European Union, but Poland remains the bloc's fourth largest emitter. We do not have time to lose, says Germany's defense minister, who's meeting his Polish, British, French, and Italian counterparts near Warsaw. The meeting of NATO's largest European defense spenders under the E5 format focused on developing Europe's defense capabilities ahead of a likely shift in policy in Washington. Our defense correspondent Mark Steele attended the meeting. Marek, good evening. Now, what did the defense ministers have to say today here in Warsaw?
Good evening, Don. Well, this new format, the E5 group, was launched after the election in the United States in November. So the first meeting took shortly after that election, when it was clear that Donald Trump is taking power in the White House. This was a response, a European response of the biggest defense spenders, that they are taking security, or they want to take security of their continent, Europe, into their own hands. So this was the second meeting of the defense ministers, this time in Poland. The last one was in Berlin. So in participation was, of course, the defense ministers from Poland, Germany, the UK, France, and Italy. And there are two most important aims of these meetings, because first, they're about enhancing defense capabilities of their own countries, of NATO, and supporting the eastern flank. On the other hand, it is about further supporting Ukraine, not allowing Ukraine to lose in a wake of the potential shift of policy in Washington and Donald Trump taking power there. But a lot has been also discussed about defense spending itself and the 2% threshold, which was set years ago by NATO. And not all nations of the North Atlantic Alliance comply with this threshold. Let's take a listen to what the defense ministers spoke about here today near Warsaw.
Zwiększanie potencjałów obronnych.
Increasing defense capabilities, readiness of our forces and troops. We'll discuss this during our meeting in Paris. We will debate them about the means of development and subsidization of the defense industry in Europe. We consider an absolute priority standardization of procedures, simplification of rules, placing as number one the defense industry in Europe.
The United Kingdom is committed to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, and we're doubling down on our support for Ukraine. Before Christmas, the UK announced our latest £225 million package of military aid, and we've committed to provide £3 billion a year of military support each and every year for as long as it takes. In 2025, the UK will spend more than ever before on military support for Ukraine.
This is the main question of how soon we will be fully capable of defending ourselves at the time when, according to our forecasts, it will be necessary.
When Moscow is arming herself, it doesn't look at how much it costs. It counts those fighter jets, it counts those defense systems or tanks it needs. So 2% GDP, but that is military relativity.
As for Italy and the obligation adopted, we will certainly abide by these 2%. If the 2% increases in The Hague, it is not only Italy or France that will decide, but many other countries, probably following the example of other countries such as Poland.
So we can see that there was not an agreement when it comes to hiring this defense spending threshold from 2%. We have to remember that Donald Trump recently proposed hiring to 5%, but countries of Western Europe especially have rejected these claims. So no breakthrough was achieved here today in that regard. Back to you, Don.
All right, it seems like, well, many more of these meetings yet ahead. Marek Steele reporting from Warsaw. Thank you for that. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte visited the European Parliament today to shore up more support for NATO and Ukraine. After repeating his call for alliance members to adhere to defense spending targets, the top boss was grilled by MEPs on how to keep the bloc safe from internal and external threats. Our correspondent in Brussels, Angela Skujins, has more.
Security in the EU does not come for free. This was the resounding message by NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte as he visited European Parliament today since first taking office in October. Now, this is the first official appearance of him in the hemicycle, and it was designed to drum up support for the NATO military alliance, as well as Ukraine, as that country where there's another year of Russian aggression and invasion. Now, unsurprisingly, he said the major issue facing the continent in terms of security is NATO members that are not meeting that 2% funding GDP benchmark. He also said that roughly only 2/3 of NATO alliance members are close to hitting that target. He also mentioned that the EU's reticence to not looking outside the bloc for manufacturing partners was preventing the distribution of arms at an efficient pace. And while fielding questions from MEPs about the incoming presidency of US leader Donald Trump, who has signalled that he wanted to potentially take the Arctic island of Greenland by force, Rutte was careful to suggest that he did not want to create new barriers or obstacles within NATO and foster better relations. Now, in another corner of Brussels, the European Commission announced that roughly 150 million euros will be distributed to Ukraine and Moldova to help refugees impacted by the war. 8 million of those euros will be earmarked for refugees in Moldova to access cash payments as well as medical and psychosocial support. The announcement came as the EU Commissioner for Equality, Haja Labib, was visiting some of those war-torn communities in Kyiv. Now, this is the latest from Brussels in terms of security. My name is Angela Skujins, reporting from TVP World.
Preparations are underway for the second inauguration of Donald Trump as president. As always, the guest list is set to include a who's who of high-profile guests. But what makes this year's ceremony unusual are the foreign leaders who have been invited to attend, marking a break with tradition. Sasha Farbach has more in his report.
January 20th will see the full pomp and ceremony of the U.S. Capitol on display as Americans see the return of President Donald Trump to the White House. However, this year, Team Trump has broken with tradition in inviting a whole host of foreign leaders to be around the president's unique moment. Political and ideological allies like Italy's Giorgia Meloni, Argentina's President Javier Milei, Brazil's former President Javier Bolsonaro. However, as certain leaders may see this as an opportunity to curry favor, it may well be a show for Trump's own base.
And the context is not international. It is Trump's own public opinion. Expects him to be tough, expects him to be winning. Look at his pronouncement concerning the future of Greenland, Canada, and Panama Canal.
It's playing to his base, which has been a hallmark of Donald Trump, not just over the course of the campaign, but also in the last weeks. His recent announcements over his plans for Canada, the Panama Canal, and the control of Greenland have sparked concern. However, according to some experts, it could also be in line with a new type of foreign policy, which aims to keep other powers out of the Western Hemisphere.
I do think that sort of Trump is signalling that he's going to push back at what he sees as growing Russian and Chinese influence in that part of the world, the Arctic, and also further south of the Rio Grande in Latin America overall.
As his own supporters and American policymakers surround him during his inauguration, the presence of ideologically aligned world leaders also underscores one of Trump's trademarks, making a deal. This will have Western allies and Ukraine particularly nervous, but it's a foregone conclusion that those close to the new president have their sights set on exactly that.
So from President Trump's perspective, you can't enter a deal if you don't have some type of relationship and dialogue with the other side, and we will absolutely establish that in the coming months.
Thank you very much.
As Donald Trump returns to the Oval Office, these last months have been full of speculation. Though looking at the unprecedented foreign leaders who will be around Trump, it does paint a picture that the second Trump administration will be anything but ordinary. Sasha Farbach for TVP World.
And now to a backlash over avoided election. Thousands of Romanian citizens took to the streets of Bucharest, demanding a runoff in the country's presidential election. Romania's constitutional court annulled the first round of the vote in early December of 2024 after evidence of foreign interference in the electoral process was uncovered. Carolina Stoltzman reports.
This demonstration in the Romanian capital Bucharest marked the biggest protest yet in the wake of November's cancelled presidential election.
A good portion of electoral, they are sort of lost, if not very angry.
I came here to show with this symbolic coffin what happened in Romania.
The right-wing populist Alliance for the Unity of Romanians called on their supporters to join the rally.
We protest against the coup d'etat that happened on December 6th, and we're calling for a return of democracy with a reinstatement of the second round of the presidential elections.
Romania's constitutional court annulled the results of the first round of the election, citing Russian influence through the illegal use of digital technology.
We see this efficiency of this information spread by social platforms in the countries, in the societies that are deeply polarized, where the level of social trust is very, very low.
The winner, the right-wing and populist Călin Georgescu, was accused of using undeclared sources of funding.
We need more transparency. We still have to declassify a lot of reports.
And there is a sense of urgency.
Every day that drags out more, Călin Georgescu wins more support.
The new presidential election in Romania is scheduled to take place on May 4th, with a runoff planned 2 weeks later. Călin Georgescu is eligible to run for office again. Experts say Romania serves as a lesson.
Poland is worryingly similar to what we see in Romania.
Polish citizens will also head to the polls in May to elect their new president.
As Transnistria no longer receives free gas from Russia, this pro-Russian breakaway region in Moldova is facing a humanitarian crisis, with residents partially cut off from electricity and heating. However, it's not only Transnistria that's suffering. Some other regions of Moldova are facing the same challenges. Our correspondent Pavel Trzaskowski visited a crossing between Transnistria and Moldova proper and has this report.
I am now in Varnita, a small town of around 5,000 next to the Moldovan-Transnistrian border. Although we haven't crossed any borders to get here, we had to go past 2 roadblocks, block posts, manned by Russian soldiers. Russian soldiers on the ground of Moldova, a country that hopes to join the European Union by 2030. Actually, right next to me is a local town hall with Moldovan and European Union flags on top. And the reason I'm here in Varnita is because the town is connected to the Transnistrian energy grid. And since Transnistria no longer receives gas from Russia, this means that there are rolling blackouts in the town as well.
They turn off the power for 3 to 4 hours every day.
Do you have any electricity?
We have a stove.
Do you have problems with electricity?
Of course.
How long were the power shortages?
Today, 5 hours. Yesterday, 3 hours.
And do you have heating at home?
No.
If you walk around the town, you will hear a constant hum of power generators. Power generators, some of them were provided by the central government in Chișinău. More permanent solutions to the energy crisis will be undertaken later this year. Permanent solutions which mean connecting the region to the main energy grid of Moldova. But until this happens, local citizens will have to cope with the temporary solutions. From Varnita, Moldova, for TVP World, I'm Pavel Trzaskowski.
A new approach by the United States is throwing a wrench in Moscow's plot to circumvent oil and gas sanctions using its so-called shadow fleet. Meanwhile, Europe is having a hard time stopping the ships, which are registered in some exotic locations. Michel van Blumenstein has more.
Repairing undersea cables like the S-Link 2 power cable between Finland and Estonia is an expensive nuisance. The operation will last well into the summer and cost millions of euros, courtesy of an anchor-dragging ship likely operated by Russia.
We have heard and interrogated the ship's crew, and at the moment, we have questioned 9 crew members as suspects who are under travel bans in order to secure the investigation.
But cable cutting is only a secondary role of the so-called shadow fleet. Russian oil is subject to a price cap, which in theory would mean Moscow can only get $60 per barrel. By employing ships registered by shell companies all over the world, Russia is selling it at prices much closer to actual market value. But on Friday, the United States tightened the noose considerably. Together with the United Kingdom, the Biden administration sanctioned close to 200 individual vessels and their operators. That's very likely to have consequences.
There will be some significant disruption to Russian flows, at least initially. We think that could be up to 1 million barrels a day of Russian crude exports that are disrupted, at least at first.
The first results are already in. Ships have been reported being turned away from ports in India and China out of fear of secondary American sanctions. Companies taking in the sanctioned vessels risk being cut off from the Western financial system, says Filip Rudnik of Warsaw Center for Eastern Studies.
So it's a huge blow disrupting right now the export flows of the Russian cargo, because effectively these tankers will experience hardships when it comes to discharging its cargo. And we can see that some of those are right now remain idle.
Ukraine has reacted positively to the new sanctions.
Without a tanker fleet, Russia will be left without effective mechanisms for circumventing sanctions, which will further cut it off from global markets.
But why doesn't Europe follow suit? First of all, it doesn't have the tools for secondary sanctions like the United States does, experts say. Meanwhile, the risk for member states goes beyond cable cutting, as many of the tankers are aging. Just last week, a ship suspected of being part of the shadow fleet was caught adrift in the Baltic. German authorities eventually towed the vessel to harbor. Putting up an effective fight against the shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea would hurt Russia tremendously.
Remembering the fact that 30 or 40% of the Russian budget is made by the oil and gas sector, I think it's worth to try if we are considering ourselves as the allies of Ukraine and trying to, weaken the position of Russia.
The main avenue European countries are now exploring is increasing their presence in Baltic waters and looking at the insurance papers and safety records of suspected shadow fleet vessels. But given that maritime law allows for free passage even through territorial waters, that will be challenging to put into place.
As the world grapples with climate change, governments try to come up with new ways to reduce their country's CO2 emissions. Meanwhile, climate activists have defaced Charles Darwin's grave at Westminster Abbey on Monday. They say the move is meant to protest the fact that the world has moved closer to warming more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. New data shows 2024 was the planet's hottest year on record. Alex Sunlinsky has the details in her report.
This is the moment climate activists from Just Stop Oil painted over the grave of British naturalist Charles Darwin at London's Westminster Abbey on Monday. They wrote 1.5 is dead over the surface of the white marble gravestone in reference to recent news that global temperatures in 2024 exceeded 1.5 Celsius above the pre-industrial era for the first time.
Millions are being displaced. California is on fire, and 3/4 of all wildlife has disappeared since the 1970s.
To make matters worse, the world's richest 1% have already used up their fair share of the global carbon budget for 2025, a mere 2 weeks into the new year. This group is responsible for more than twice as much carbon pollution each year as the poorest half of humanity. But it is the poorest people who are suffering the most serious effects of climate breakdown.
Reducing substantial human impact on the climate is crucial for the future.
But there is some good news amid the alarming numbers. Eurostat has published a report showing the EU has seen a 7% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions in comparison with 2022 and 18% compared to 2013. Among member countries, Germany contributed the most to the total EU emissions generated in 2023. Next were France and Italy. Poland came in fourth place. But a few factors have to be kept in mind to continue the downward trend in greenhouse gas emissions.
Renewable energy, as you know, all the countries in European Union increase its use of renewable energy sources. And of course, in 2023, renewable energy sources just increased significantly, especially in electricity generation. The second is a decline in fossil fuel use. There has been a substantial decrease in the use of fossil fuels.
According to a recent report by Statistics Poland, it's China that contributes the most in terms of global emissions with 30%. Poland trails far behind with 0.69%. Also noteworthy is that while the rest of the world is emitting more greenhouse gases, Poland's greenhouse gas emissions fell by 29% over the same 33-year period.
Defense ministers of Poland, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Italy, also known as the E5, met in Warsaw today. The focus was on integrating European defense production, continued support for Ukraine in its war with Russia, and even integrating Ukrainian military production with that of Europe. Furthermore, Polish Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz reaffirmed that the Ramstein contact group for Ukraine will continue with U.S. involvement. And now joining us to discuss these issues and more is Diane Francis, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Hello and good evening, and thank you very much for joining me on World News tonight.
Great. No problem.
Now, I'd like to start off, we've been talking about integrating production of military equipment and ammunition here in Europe for some time now. But what are the biggest hurdles that prevent this from happening more quickly?
Well, I would assume that there's a lot of fighting over market share. Who's going to be the one to make this or that, and how much, and at what price? So you have the competitive challenge among the industrialists who are in the military-industrial complex. You have the governmental competition too, and then you have the militaries that all need different weapons and components and ammunition. And so it is really a very difficult task. Overhanging the entire process, of course, is the question mark as to how much more the Americans will continue to shovel into helping Ukraine, and how much more the Europeans are prepared to help as well, above and beyond what they've done already. So this is, frankly, this is a do or die situation.
It certainly is, and looking at the results of the meeting today, they still failed to agree to more defense spending above the 2% threshold. How long can Europe continue to put this off, especially with incoming President-elect Donald Trump coming into office very soon and setting the bar even higher?
Yeah, he wants 5% commitment from the nations instead of 2%. Most of them aren't even making 2%. That includes the country I live in, Canada, and most of the Europeans. Now, Poland is the exception, and the United States. They both spend more than everybody else do on an individual basis. But, you know, they're either going to have to increase their spending, or the Americans will reduce theirs to force them to do it. You know, it really isn't fair to expect the Americans to defend Europe when Europe is just as rich as the United States, not quite, but almost. And it's the target of Russia's predations. This is a war in Europe. This is not a war in America. And so there's a lot of reasons why the Europeans really have to grow up. They really have to grow up and take responsibility for their own protection and or pay the Americans to do it.
Certainly. Now, Donald Trump, of course, a lot of Europeans remember the last time he was in office. Do you think that the policy that he had previously is the reason, combined with the war in Ukraine, is the reason that we've had a significant boost up to that 2% mark by many nations in NATO? And do you think that Donald Trump can be the person to eventually get Europe to actually spend more and do more and take more of the burden off the U.S. taxpayer?
Oh, yeah, he's totally responsible for any increase in spending since the last time he was in office and started to complain about no one meeting the 2% NATO commitment. And I think the figure he uses, I don't know if it's true, is that as a result of his hectoring Europe, the amount of spending went up by $280 billion. And then, of course, there was a war in between, which also got people to focus on the importance of their own security and helping Ukraine. Now he's set the bar at 5%. And I think that given his proclivity and his nationalism and his toughness, I think, again, he really means it. And I think, again, I would expect that Europeans had better understand that they have to at least double, not Poland, double their commitment to security.
And concerning Donald Trump, who's just about to take office, what are your assessments, if you will, as to what he will do with the war in Ukraine? I know that he said he could solve it in 24 hours. That obviously is not going to happen. Now he's pushed the bar off to about 6 months. But do you think President Trump will take a good, rational approach to the conflict and try and shore up defenses for Ukraine at the same time, not making a bad deal with Russia at Ukraine's detriment?
Well, I think that people that really understand the situation and understand Russia are in his organization, his management team, or if you like, his government team. They get it. They have to really keep spending and supporting Ukraine and really force the Europeans to pony up even more and flood it with weapons and give it lots of other help, because I think Trump was thinking that he would frighten Putin into saying, okay, well, now you're in, I'll give up because you're really erratic. It hasn't worked. And in fact, right after he got in, he apparently made a phone call to Putin, or he bragged about it, and he's denying that now. He bragged that, he told him not to escalate anymore. And the day after that call was made, Putin dropped one of the worst bombs on a city in Ukraine, almost a nuclear capability, powerful bomb. And he's escalated ever since. I mean, he's absolutely destroying the energy grid in that entire country. And he's doing it, and he's killing civilians and all of that. So Trump hasn't scared him one little bit. And, the other thing is that Putin has no public opinion to please. He's the boss. He's a dictator, and he doesn't get any pushback from his public. So they're long-suffering. They've always been long-suffering. I don't know if they have a brain in their head, the Russians, but they do. They suffer, and they do nothing. And so nothing's changed. And Trump is not... I think he actually thought he'd swagger in. This was the pitch he gave to Americans. I'll swagger and I'll fix this. It never would have happened if I'd been in office. Well, you know what? It would have happened if he'd been in office. He can't stop it unless he does what Biden finally realized he had to do, and the Europeans must realize, and that is just flood Ukraine with weapons and help.
Now, also today, China refused 3 Russian tankers, part of its shadow fleet, Russia's shadow fleet, carrying over 1 million barrels of oil. And India says that it will not take oil from Russia that are under U.S. sanctions. This looks like the final act of President Biden. Very briefly, is this a good final act as Donald Trump gets ready to take the White House?
Well, I think China and India have been accessories to the crime. They're just taking tons. They're financing the war by buying all this oil from Russia, despite the fact that, obviously there were sanctions on it. They get around the sanctions, or they pay them or whatever. They get paid by selling weapons to the Russians. I mean, they're up to their armpits in helping him in this war. And I think they should pay a huge price diplomatically and influence-wise for what they're doing. So at least they're trying to do some things now, it looks like. But again, like the Europeans, they need to be kicked. They need to be kicked into stopping doing this. I mean, the Europeans are not fighting the war the way they should, and they're not helping Ukraine the way they should. And India and China are actually accomplices in helping him wage war. So, you know, this is something that I hope that Trump does take on in a big way also. And, you know, the pressure has to be on because no one can expect the Americans to look after anything but America anymore because, you know, it's just horrendously expensive. And, you know, Russia has to have its income cut off. I think what's going on in the Baltic is a good start, but I think that every bloody shadow ship that the Russians sell their sanctioned oil through should be stopped, impeded, inspected, made to tie up in port, confiscate the value of the assets, punish and penalize the owners and the captains and the crew. I mean, I don't know what else you can do. And we can do that. We can do that if we want to. It has to be done.
Well, let's certainly hope that that does indeed happen. Diane Francis, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, thank you very much for joining me today.
You're welcome. Anytime.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you all for watching. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.